I spent a good part of my early life at Wimbledon. My mother and father did not get rid of the house, a big one near the Common, until sometime about the end of the war. Yet of all the time I spent in it, I can recall little or nothing of significance. But after the age of 11 or 12 I was away at school, and in the spring and summer holidays we were all in the country, so that I was only at Wimbledon in the Christmas holidays and for a day or two at the beginning and end of the other holidays. London was only a half-hour away, and yet we seldom went there. My mother and father never took us to the theater, not even to pantomimes, and until the middle of the war I had only been to the theater twice in my life, and then only to children's plays, taken by an aunt. My mother wished to bring us up to be serious, and to benefit humanity in some practical way. She allowed us no hint of its dirtiness and intrigue and lustfulness, believing that innocence was the surest protection against them. Our reading was carefully censored by her. I was destined to be, if not a great man, at least a good man. Our treats were educational or aesthetic, to Kew Gardens, Hampton Court, the Zoo, the British Museum, or the Natural History Museum. I remember my mother, in the treasure room at the British Museum, telling us with shining eyes that all these treasures were ours. We looked at her astonished. She said, "Yes, they belong to us as members of the public. We can look at them, admire them, and study them for as long as we like. If we had them back at home, we couldn't do more." We read more books than most children do. There must have been 4,000 or 5,000 books in the house. The PG-53 consisted of an old-fashioned scholar's library bequeathed to my father by my namesake, whom I have mentioned as a friend of Wordsworth, but who had a far more tender friendship with Felicia Hemans. To this was added my father's own collection of books, mostly poetry, with a particular cupboard for Anglo-Irish literature. Devotional works contributed by my mother, educational books sent to my father by their publishers in the hope that he would recommend them for use in government schools, and novels and adventure books brought into the house by my elder brothers and sisters. My mother used to tell us stories about inventors and doctors who gave their lives for the suffering, and poor boys who struggled to the top of the tree, and saintly men who made examples of themselves. There was also the parable of the king who had a very beautiful garden which he threw open to the public. 2 students entered, and one, who was the person of whom my mother spoke with a slight sneer in her voice, noticed occasional weeds even in the tulip beds, but the other, and there she brightened up, found beautiful flowers growing even on rubbish heaps. She kept off the subject of war as much as possible. She always had difficulty in explaining to us how it was that God permitted wars. The Boer War clouded my early childhood. Philip, my eldest brother, who also called himself a Fenian, was a pro-Boer, and there was great tension at the breakfast table between him and my father, whose political views were always orthodox. The sale of the Wimbledon house solved a good many problems. It was getting too full. My mother hated throwing away anything that could possibly, in the most remote contingency, be of any service to anyone. The medicine PG-54 cupboard was perhaps the most significant corner of the house. Nobody could say that it was untidy exactly. All the bottles had stoppers, but they were so crowded together that it was impossible for anybody except my mother, who had a long memory, to know what was at the back. Every few years, no doubt, she went through this cupboard. If there was any doubtful bottle, she would tentatively relabel it. This must be Alfred's old bunion salve. And another strychnine, query? Even special medicines prescribed for scarlet fever or whooping cough were kept, in case of reinfection. She was always an energetic labeler. She wrote in one of my school prizes, "Robert Rank Graves won this book as a prize for being first in his class in the term's work and second in examinations. He also won a special prize for divinity, though the youngest boy in the class. Written by his affectionate mother, Amy Graves." Summer 1908. Homemade jam used always to arrive at table well labeled. 1 small pot red, gooseberry, lemon, and rhubarb. A little shop gooseberry added. Nellie reboiled. In a recent book, Mrs. Fisher, I moralized on 3 sayings and a favorite story of my mother's. I ascribed them there for the argument's sake to my Danish grandmother. They were these. "Children, I command you, as your mother, never to swing objects around in your hands. The King of Hanover put out his eye by swinging a bead purse. Children, I command you as your mother to be careful when you carry your candles up to bed. The candle is a little cup of grease. There was a man once, a Frenchman, who died of grief because he could never become a mother." PG-55 and the story told in candlelight. There was once a peasant family living in Schleswig-Holstein, where they all have crooked mouths, and one night they wished to blow out the candle. The father's mouth was twisted to the left, so, and he tried to blow out the candle, so. But he was too proud to stand anywhere but directly before the candle, and he puffed, but could not blow the candle out. And then the mother tried, but her mouth was twisted to the right, so, and she tried to blow, so, and she was too proud to stand anywhere but directly before the candle, and she puffed and puffed, but could not blow the candle out. Then there was the brother with mouth twisted outward, so, and the sister with the mouth twisted downward, so, and they tried each in their turn, so, and the idiot baby with his mouth twisted in an eternal grin tried, so, and at last the maid, a beautiful girl from Copenhagen with a perfectly formed mouth, put it out with her shoe, so, flap. These quotations make it clear how much more I owe, as a writer, to my mother than to my father. She also taught me to speak the truth and shame the devil. Her favorite biblical exhortation was, "My son, whatever thy hand findeth to do, do it with all thy might." I always felt that Wimbledon was a wrong place, neither town nor country. It was at its worst on Wednesdays, my mother's at-home day. Tea was in the drawing room. We were called down in our Sunday clothes to eat cakes, be kissed, and be polite. My sisters were made to recite. Around Christmas, celebrated in the German style, came a dozen or so children's parties. We used to make ourselves sick with PG-56 excitement. I do not like thinking of Wimbledon. Every spring and summer after my third year, unless we happened to go to Germany, or to France as we did once, we went to Harlech in North Wales. My mother had built a house there. In the days before motor traffic began around the North Welsh coast, Harlech was a very quiet place and little known, even as a golf center. It was in three parts. First, the village itself, 500 feet up on a steep range of hills. It had granite houses with slate roofs and ugly windows and gables, chapels of 7 or 8 different denominations, enough shops to make it the shopping center of the smaller villages around, and the castle, a favorite playground of ours. Then there was the Morpha, a flat plain from which the sea had receded. Part of this was the golf links, but to the north was a stretch of wild country, which we used to visit in the spring in search of plover's eggs. The sea was beyond the links, good hard sand stretching for miles, safe bathing, and sandhills for hide and seek. The third part of Harlech, which became the most important to us, was never visited by golfers, or the few other summer visitors, or by the village people themselves. This was the desolate rocky hill country at the back of the village. As we grew older, we spent more and more of our time up there, and less on the beach and the links, which were the most obvious attractions of the place. There were occasional farms, or rather crofts, in these hills, but one could easily walk 15 or 20 miles without crossing a road or passing close to a farm. Originally, we went up there with some practical excuse, for the blueberries on the hills near Maisie Garned, or for the cranberries at Gwallan, or to find bits of Roman Hapacost tiling, with the PG-57 potter's thumb marks still on them, in the ruined Roman villas by Casteltomonimer, or for globe flowers in the upper Artro, or to catch a sight of the wild goats that lived at the back of Rhinog Far, the biggest of the hills of the next range, or to get raspberries from the thickets near Cumbachan Lake, or to find white heather on a hill that we did not know the name of away to the north of the Roman steps. But after a time we walked about those hills simply because they were good to walk about on. They had a penny plain quality about them that was even better than the twopence-colored quality of the Bavarian Alps. My best friend at the time was my sister Rosaline, who was 1 year older than myself. I suppose what I liked about this country, and I know no country like it, was its independence of formal nature. The passage of the seasons was hardly noticed there. The wind always seemed to be blowing, and the grass always seemed to be withered, and the small streams were always cold and clear, running over black stones. Sheep were the only animals about, but they were not nature, except in the lambing season. They were too close to the granite boulders covered with gray lichen that lay about everywhere. There were few trees except a few nut bushes, rowans, stunted oaks, and thorn bushes in the valleys. The winters were always mild, so that last year's bracken and last year's heather lasted in a faded way through to the next spring. There were almost no birds except an occasional buzzard and curlews crying in the distance, and wherever we went we felt that the rocky skeleton of the hill was only an inch or two under the turf. Once, when I came home on leave from the war, I spent about a week of my 10 days walking about on these hills to restore my sanity. I tried to do the same after PG-58 I was wounded, but by that time the immediate horror of death was too strong for the indifference of the hills to relieve it. I am glad that it was Wales and not Ireland. We never went to Ireland, except once when I was an infant in arms. We had no Welsh blood in us, and did not like the Harlech villagers much. We had no temptation to learn Welsh, or to pretend ourselves Welsh. We knew that country as a quite ungeographical region. Any stray sheep farmers that we met, who belonged to the place, we resented somehow as intruders on our privacy. Clarissa, Rosaline, and I were once out on the remotest hills and had not seen a soul all day. At last we came to a waterfall and two trout lying on the bank beside it. 10 yards away was the fisherman. He was disentangling his line from a thorn bush and had not seen us. So we crept up quietly to the fish and put a sprig of white bell heather, which we had found that afternoon, in the mouth of each. We hurried back to cover, and I said, "Shall we watch?" But Clarissa said, "No, don't spoil it." So we came home and never spoke of it again, even to each other, and never knew the sequel. If it had been Ireland, we would have self-consciously learned Irish and the local legends. Instead, we came to know the country more purely, as a place whose history was too old for local legends. When we were up walking there, we made our own. We decided who was buried under the Standing Stone, and who had lived in the ruined Round Hut encampment, and in the caves of the valley where the big Rowans were. On our visits to Germany, I had felt a sense of home in my blood in a natural human way. But on the hills behind Harlech, I found a personal harmony independent of history or geography. The first poem I wrote as myself concerned that hill country. PG 59. The first poem I wrote as a Graves was a free translation of a satire by Catullus. My father was always too busy and absent-minded to worry much about us children. My mother did worry, yet she allowed us to go off immediately after breakfast into the hills and did not complain much when we came back long after supper time. Though she had a terror of heights herself, she never restrained us from climbing about in dangerous places, so we never got hurt. I had a bad head for heights and trained myself deliberately and painfully to overcome it. We used to go climbing in the turrets and towers of Harlech Castle. I have worked hard on myself in defining and dispersing terrors. The simple fear of heights was the most obvious to overcome. There was a quarry face in the garden of our Harlech house. It provided one or two easy climbs, but gradually I invented more and more difficult ones for myself. After each new success, I had to lie down, shaking with nervousness, in the safe meadow grass at the top. Once I lost my foothold on a ledge and should have been killed, but it seemed as though I improvised a foothold in the air and kicked myself up to safety from it. When I examined the place afterwards, it was almost as if the devil had given me what he had offered Christ in the temptation, the freedom to cast myself down from the rock and be restored to safety by the angels. Yet such events are not uncommon in mountain climbing. George Mallory, for instance, did an inexplicable climb on Snowdon once. He had left his pipe on a ledge halfway down one of the precipices and scrambled back by a shortcut to retrieve it, then up again by the same way. No one saw just how he did the climb, but when they came to examine it the next day for official record, they found that it was an impossible overhang nearly all the way. PG 60, the rule of the Climbers Club was that climbs should not be called after their inventors, but after natural features. An exception was made in this case. The climb was recorded something like this: Mallory's Pipe, a variation on Route 2, see adjoining map. This climb is totally impossible. It has been performed once, in failing light, by Mr. G.H.L. Mallory, PG 61 vis, about Charterhouse. Let me begin by recalling my feelings on the day that I left, about a week before the outbreak of war. I discussed them with a friend who felt much as I did. First, we said that there were perhaps even more typical public schools than Charterhouse at the time, but that this was difficult to believe. Next, that there was no possible remedy, because tradition was so strong that if one wished to break it, one would have to dismiss the whole school and staff and start all over again. But that even this would not be enough, for the school buildings were so impregnated with what was called the public school spirit, but what we felt as fundamental badness, that they would have to be demolished and the school rebuilt elsewhere, and its name changed. Next, that our only regret at leaving the place was that for the last year we had been in a position as members of sixth form to do more or less what we pleased. Now we were both going on to St. John's College, Oxford, which seemed by reputation to be merely a more boisterous repetition of Charterhouse. We would be freshmen there, and would naturally refuse to be hardy and public schoolish, and there would be all the stupidity of having our rooms raided and being forced to lose our temper and hurt somebody, and be hurt ourselves. And there would be no peace probably until we got into our third year, when we would be back again in the same sort of position as now, and in the same sort of position as in our last year at our preparatory school. In 1917, said Neville, the official seal will be out on all this dreariness. We'll get our degrees, and then we'll have to start as new boys again in some dreary profession. My God, he said, turning to me suddenly, I can't stand PG 62, the idea of it. I must put something in between me and Oxford. I must at least go abroad for the whole vacation. I did not feel that 3 months was long enough. I had a vague intention of running away to sea. Do you realize, he said to me, that we have spent 14 years of our life principally at Latin and Greek, not even competently taught, and that we are going to start another 3 years of the same thing? But, when we had said our very worst of Charterhouse, I said to him, or he said to me, I forget which. Of course, The trouble is that in the school at any given time, there are always at least 2 really decent masters among the 40 or 50, and 10 really decent fellows among the 5 or 600. We will remember them, and have lots feeling about not damning Sodom for the sake of 10 just persons. And in another 20 years' time, we'll forget this conversation and think that we were mistaken, and that perhaps everybody, with a few criminal exceptions, was fairly average decent, and we'll say, I was a young fool then, insisting on impossible perfection, and we'll send our sons to Charterhouse sentimentally, and they'll go through all we did. I do not wish this to be construed as an attack on my old school, but merely as a record of my feelings at the time. No doubt I was unappreciative of the hard knocks and character training that public schools are supposed to provide, and as a typical old Carthusian remarked to me recently, the whole moral tone of the school has improved out of all recognition since those days. As a matter of fact, I did not go up to Oxford until 5 years later, in 1919, when my brother, 4 years younger than myself, was already in residence, and I did not take my degree until 1926, at the same time as the brother who was 8 years younger than myself. Oxford was extraordinarily PG-63 kind to me. I did no Latin or Greek there, though I had a classical exhibition. I did not sit for a single examination. I never had rooms at St. John's, though I used to go there to draw a government grant for tuition fees. I lived outside the university 3-mile radius. For my last 2 undergraduate years, I did not even have a tutor. I have a warm feeling for Oxford. Its rules and statutes, though apparently cast iron, are ready for emergencies. In my case, at any rate, a poet was an emergency. Whenever I come to the word Charterhouse in this story, I find myself escaping into digressions, but I suppose that I must get through with it. From the moment I arrived at the school, I suffered an oppression of spirit that I hesitate now to recall in its full intensity. It was something like being in that chilly cellar at Laufsorn among the potatoes, but being a potato out of a different bag from the rest. The school consisted of about 600 boys. The chief interests were games and romantic friendships. Schoolwork was despised by everyone. The scholars, of whom there were about 50 in the school at any given time, were not concentrated in a single dormitory house as at Winchester, but divided among 10. They were known as pros, and unless they were good at games and willing to pretend that they hated work as much as or more than the non-scholars, and ready whenever called on to help these with their work, they usually had a bad time. I was a scholar and really liked work, and I was surprised and disappointed at the apathy of the classrooms. My first term I was left alone more or less, it being a school convention that new boys should be neither encouraged nor baited. The other boys seldom spoke to them except to send them on errands, or to inform them of breaches of school convention. But my second term the trouble began. There at Gaze 64 were a number of things that naturally made for my unpopularity. Besides being a scholar and not outstandingly good at games, I was always short of pocket money. I could not conform to the social custom of treating my contemporaries to food at the school shop, and because I could not treat them, I could not accept their treating. My clothes were all wrong. They conformed outwardly to the school pattern, but they were ready-made, and not of the best quality cloth that the other boys all wore. Even so, I had not been taught how to make the best of them. Neither my mother nor my father had any regard for the niceties of modern dress, and my elder brothers were abroad by this time. The other boys in my house, except for 5 scholars, were nearly all the sons of businessmen. It was a class of whose interests and prejudices I knew nothing, having hitherto only met boys of the professional class, and I talked too much for their liking. A further disability was that I was as prudishly innocent as my mother had planned I should be. I knew nothing about simple sex, let alone the many refinements of sex constantly referred to in school conversation. My immediate reaction was one of disgust. I wanted to run away. The most unfortunate disability of all was that my name appeared on the school list as R. von R. Graves. I had only known hitherto that my second name was Rank. The von, discovered on my birth certificate, was disconcerting. Carthusians were secretive about their second names. If these were fancy ones, they usually managed to conceal them. Rank without the von I could no doubt have passed off as monosyllabic in English, but von Rank was glaring. The business class to which most of the boys belonged was strongly feeling at this time the threat and even the necessity of a trade war. German meant dirty German. It meant PG-65 cheap, shoddy goods competing with our sterling industries, and it also meant military menace, Prussianism, saber-rattling. There was another boy in my house with a German name, but English by birth and upbringing. He was treated much as I was. On the other hand, a French boy in the house was very popular, though he was not much good at games. King Edward VII had done his Entente work very thoroughly. There was also considerable anti-Jewish feeling, the business prejudice again, and the legend was put about that I was not only a German, but a German Jew. Of course, I always maintained that I was Irish. This claim was resented by an Irish boy who had been in the house about a year and a half longer than myself. He went out of his way to hurt me, not only by physical acts of spite, like throwing ink over my school books, hiding my games clothes, setting on me suddenly from behind corners, pouring water over me at night, but by continually forcing his body humor on my prudishness and inviting everybody to laugh at my disgust. He also built up a sort of humorous legend of my hypocrisy and concealed depravity. I came near a nervous breakdown. School morality prevented me from informing the housemaster of my troubles. The house monitors were supposed to keep order and preserve the moral tone of the house, but at this time they were not the sort to interfere in any case of bullying among the juniors. I tried violent resistance, but as the odds were always heavily against me, this merely encouraged the ragging. Complete passive resistance would probably have been better. I only got accustomed to bawdy talk in my last 2 years at Charterhouse, and it was not until I had been some time in the army that I got hardened to it and could reply in kind to insults. PG-66A, former headmaster of Charterhouse, an innocent man, is reported to have said at a headmaster's conference, "My boys are amorous but seldom erotic." Few cases of eroticism indeed ever came to his notice. There were not more than 5 or 6 big rows all the time I was at Charterhouse, and expulsions were rare. But the housemasters knew little about what went on in their houses. Their living quarters were removed from the boys. There was a true distinction between amorousness, by which the headmaster meant a sentimental falling in love with younger boys, and eroticism, which was adolescent lust. The intimacy, as the newspapers call it, that frequently took place, was practically never between an elder boy and the object of his affection, for that would have spoilt the romantic illusion, which was heterosexually cast. It was between boys of the same age, who were not in love, but used each other coldly as convenient sex instruments. So the atmosphere was always heavy with romance of a very conventional early Victorian type, yet complicated by cynicism and foulness. PG-67-7. Halfway through my second year, I wrote to my parents to tell them that I must leave Charterhouse, because I could not stand life there any longer. I told them that the house was making it plain that I did not belong and that it did not want me. I gave them details, in confidence, to make them take my demand seriously. They were unable to respect this confidence, considering that it was their religious duty to inform the housemaster of all I had written them. They did not even tell me what they were doing. They contented themselves with visiting me and giving me assurances of the power of prayer and faith, telling me that I must endure all for the sake of— I have forgotten what exactly. Fortunately, I had not given them any account of sex irregularities in the house, so all that the housemaster did was to make a speech that night after prayers, deterrent of bullying in general. He told us that he had just had a complaint from a boy's parents. He made it plain at the same time how much he disliked informers and outside interference in affairs of the house. My name was not mentioned, but the visit of my parents on a day not a holiday had been noticed and commented on, so I had to stay on and be treated as an informer. I was now in the upper school, and so had a study of my own. But this was no security. Studies had no locks. It was always being wrecked. After my parents' visit to the housemaster, it was not even possible for me to use the ordinary house changing room. I had to remove my games clothes to a disused shower bath. My heart went wrong then. The school doctor said I was not to play football. This was low water. My last resource was to sham insanity. It succeeded unexpectedly well. Soon PG-68, nobody troubled about me except to avoid any contact with me. I must make clear that I am not charging my parents with treachery. They were trying to help me. Their honor is beyond reproach. One day I went down to Charterhouse by the special train from Waterloo to Godalming. I was too late to take a ticket. I just got into a compartment before the train started. The railway company had not provided enough coaches, so I had to stand up all the way. At Godalming Station, the crowd of boys rushing out into the station yard to secure taxis swept me past the ticket collectors, so I had got my very uncomfortable ride free. I mentioned this in my next letter home, just for something to say, and my father sent me a letter of reproach. He said that he had himself made a special visit to Waterloo Station, bought a ticket to Godalming and torn it up. My mother was even more scrupulous. A young couple on their honeymoon once happened to stop the night with us at Wimbledon and left behind them a packet of sandwiches, some of which had already been eaten. My mother sent them on. Being thrown entirely on myself, I began to write poetry. This was considered stronger proof of insanity than the formal straws I wore in my hair. The poetry I wrote was not the easy showing-off witty stuff that all the graves write and have written for the last couple of centuries. It was poetry that was dissatisfied with itself. When, later, things went better with me at Charterhouse, I became literary once more. I sent one of my poems to the school magazine, The Carthusian. On the strength of it, I was invited to join the school poetry society. This was a most anomalous organization, PG-69 for Charterhouse. It consisted of 7 members. The meetings, for the reading and discussion of poetry, were held once a month at the house of Guy Kendall, then a form master at the school, now headmaster of University College School at Hampstead. The members were 4 sixth form boys and 2 boys a year and a half older than myself, one of whom was called Raymond Rodakowski. None of them were in the same house as myself. At Charterhouse, no friendship was permitted between boys of different houses or of different years beyond a formal acquaintance at work, or organized games like cricket and football. It was, for instance, impossible for boys of different houses, though related or next-door neighbors at home, even to play a friendly game of tennis or squash rackets together. They would never have heard the last of it. So the friendship that began between me and Raymond was most unconventional. Coming home one evening from a meeting of the society, I told Raymond about life in the house. I told him what had happened a week or 2 before. My study had been raided, and one of my more personal poems had been discovered and pinned up on the public notice board in writing school. This was the living room of the members of the lower school, into which, as a member of the upper school, I was not allowed to go, and so could not rescue the poem. Raymond was the first person I had been able to talk to humanly. He was indignant, and took my arm in his in the gentlest way. "They are bloody barbarians," he said. He told me that I must pull myself together and do something about it. "Because I was a good poet," he said, "and a good person. I loved him for that," he said. "You're not allowed to play football. Why don't you box? It's supposed to be good for the heart." So I laughed and said I would. Then Raymond PG-70 said, "I expect they rag you about your initials." "Yes," I said. "They call me a dirty German." "I had trouble too," he said, "before I took up boxing." Raymond's mother was Scottish. His father was an Austrian Pole. Very few boys at Charterhouse boxed, and the boxing room, which was over the school confectionery shop, was a good place to meet Raymond, whom, otherwise, I would not have been able to see often. I began boxing seriously and savagely. Raymond said to me, "You know these cricketers and footballers are all afraid of boxers, almost superstitious. They won't box themselves for fear of losing their good looks. The inter-house competitions every year are such bloody affairs. But do you remember the Mansfield, Waller, and Taylor show? That's a good tradition to keep up." Of course I remembered. 2 terms previously there had been a meeting of the school debating society which I had attended. The committee of the debating society was usually made up of 6th form boys. The debates were formal and usually dull, but insofar as there was any intellectual life at Charterhouse, it was represented by the debating society, and by the Carthusian, always edited by 2 members of this committee. Both institutions were free from influence of the masters. Debates were always held in the school library on Saturday night. One debate night, the usual decorous conventions were broken by an invasion of the Bloods. The Bloods were the members of the cricket and football 11s. They were the ruling caste at Charterhouse. The 11th man in the football 11, though a member of the under 4th form, had a great deal more prestige than the most brilliant classical scholar in the 6th. Even head of the school was an empty title. There was not, PG-71, however, an open warfare between the 6th form intellectuals and the Bloods. The Bloods were stupid and knew it, and had nothing to gain by a clash. The intellectuals were happy to be left alone. So this invasion of the Bloods, who had just returned from winning a match against the Casuals, and had probably been drinking, caused the debating society a good deal of embarrassment. The Bloods disturbed the meeting by cheers and cat cries and slamming the library magazine folders on the table. Mansfield, as president of the society, called them to order, but they continued the disturbance, so Mansfield closed the debate. The Bloods thought the incident finished, but it was not. A letter appeared in the Carthusian a few days later protesting against the bad behavior in the debating society of certain first 11 babies. 3 sets of initials were signed, and they were those of Mansfield, Waller, and Taylor. The school was astonished by this suicidally daring act. It waited for Cora, Dathan, and Abiram to be swallowed up. The captain of football is said to have sworn that he'd chucked the 3 signatories into the fountain in Founder's Court, but somehow he did not. The fact was that this happened early in the autumn term, and there were only 2 other first 11 colors left over from the preceding year. New colors were only given gradually as the football season advanced. The other rowdies had only been embryo Bloods, so it was a matter entirely between these 3 sixth form intellectuals and the 3 colors of the first 11. And the first 11 were uncomfortably aware that Mansfield was the heavyweight boxing champion of the school, Waller the runner-up for the middleweights, and that Taylor was also a person to be reckoned with. A tough fellow, though not perhaps a boxer, I forget. While the first 11 were PG-72 wondering what on earth to do, their 3 opponents decided to take the war into the enemy's country. The social code of Charterhouse was based on a very strict caste system. The caste marks were slight distinctions in dress. A new boy had no privileges at all. A boy in his second term might wear a knitted tie instead of a plain one. A boy in his second year might wear colored socks. Third year gave most of the privileges: turned down collars, colored handkerchiefs, a coat with a long roll, and so on. Fourth year, a few more, such as the right to get up raffles. But very peculiar and unique distinctions were reserved for the Bloods. These included light gray flannel trousers, butterfly collars, coats slit up the back, and the privilege of walking arm in arm. So the next Sunday, Mansfield, Waller, and Taylor did the bravest thing that was ever done at Charterhouse. The school chapel service was at 11 in the morning, but the custom was for the school to be in its seats by 5 minutes to 11, and to sit waiting there. At 2 minutes to 11, the Bloods used to stalk in. At 1.5 minutes came the masters. At 1 minute came the choir in its surplices. Then the headmaster arrived and the service started. If any boy was accidentally late and sneaked in between 5 minutes to and 2 minutes to the hour, he was followed by 600 pairs of eyes. There was nudging and giggling, and he would not hear the last of it for a long time. It was as though he were pretending to be a Blood. On this Sunday, then, when the Bloods had come in with their usual swaggering assurance, an extraordinary thing happened. The 3 sixth formers slowly walked up the aisle, magnificent in gray flannel trousers, slit coats, first 11 collars, and with pink carnations in their buttonholes. It is PG-73 impossible to describe the astonishment and terror that this spectacle caused. Everyone looked at the captain of the first 11. He had gone quite white. But by this time the masters had come in, followed by the choir, and the opening hymn, though raggedly sung, ended the tension. When chapel emptied, it always emptied according to school order, that is, according to position in work. The sixth form went out first. The Bloods were not high in school order, so Mansfield, Waller, and Taylor had the start of them. After chapel on Sunday, the custom in the winter terms was for people to meet and gossip in the school library, so it was here that Mansfield, Waller, and Taylor went. They had buttonholed a talkative master and drawn him with them into the library, and there they kept him talking until dinner time. If the Bloods had had courage to do anything desperate, they would have had to do it at once, but they could not make a scene in the presence of a master. Mansfield, Waller, and Taylor went down to their houses for dinner, still talking to the master. After this, they kept together as much as possible, and the school, particularly the lower school, which had always chafed under the dress regulations, made heroes of them, and began scoffing at the Bloods as weak-kneed. Finally, the captain of the 11 was stupid enough to complain to the headmaster about this breach of school conventions, asking for permission to enforce first 11 rights by disciplinary measures. The headmaster, who was a scholar and disliked the game's tradition, refused his request. He said that the sixth form deserved as distinctive privileges as the first 11. The sixth form would therefore in future be entitled to hold what they had assumed. After this, the prestige of the Bloods declined greatly. Buggy 74A. At Raymond's encouragement, I pulled myself together, and my third year found things very much easier for me. My chief persecutor, the Irishman, had left. It was said that he had had a bad nervous breakdown. He wrote me a hysterical letter demanding my forgiveness for his treatment of me, saying at the same time that if I did not give this forgiveness, one of his friends, whom he mentioned, was still in the house to persecute me. I did not answer the letter. I do not know what happened to him. The friend never bothered. I still had no friends except among the junior members of the house, to whom I did not disguise my dislike of the seniors. I found the juniors were on the whole a decent lot of fellows. Towards the end of this year, in the annual boxing and gymnastic display, I fought 3 rounds with Raymond. There is a lot of sex feeling in boxing. The dual play, the reciprocity, the pain not felt as pain. This exhibition match to me had something of the quality that Dr. Marie Stopes would call sacramental. We were out neither to hurt nor win, though we hit each other hard. This public appearance as a boxer improved my position in the house. And the doctor now allowed me to play football again, and I played it fairly well. Then things started going wrong in a different way. It began with confirmation, for which I was prepared by a zealous evangelical master. For a whole term I concentrated all my thoughts on religion, looking forward to the ceremony as a spiritual climax. When it came and the Holy Ghost did not descend in the form of a dove, and I did not find myself gifted with tongues, and nothing spectacular happened, except that the boy whom the Bishop of Zululand was blessing at the same time as myself slipped off the narrow footstool on which we were both kneeling, I was bound to feel a reaction. Raymond had not been confirmed, and I was astonished to hear him admit, and even boast, that he was an atheist. I argued with him about the existence of God and the divinity of Christ, and the necessity of the Trinity. He said of the Trinity, that anybody who could agree with the Athanasian Creed that whoever will be saved must confess that there are not three incomprehensibles but one incomprehensible, was saying PG-76, that a man must go to hell if he does not believe something that is by definition impossible to understand. He said that his respect for himself as a reasonable being did not allow him to believe such things. He also asked me a question. What's the good of having a soul if you have a mind? What's the function of the soul? It seems a mere pawn in the game. I was shocked, but because I loved him and respected him, I felt bound to find an answer. The more I thought about it, the less certain I became that he was wrong. So in order not to prejudice religion, and I put religion and my chances of salvation before human love, I at first broke my friendship with Raymond entirely. Later I weakened, but he would not even meet me, when I approached him, with any broad church compromise. He was a complete and ruthless atheist, and I could not appreciate his strength of spirit. For the rest of our time at Charterhouse, we were not as close as we should have been. I met Raymond in France in 1917, when he was with the Irish Guards. I rode over to see him one afternoon and felt as close to him as I had ever felt. He was killed at Cambrai not long after. My feeling for Raymond was more comradely than amorous. In my fourth year, an even stronger relationship started. It was with a boy 3 years younger than myself, who was exceptionally intelligent and fine-spirited. Call him Dick, because his real name was the same as that of another person in the story. He was not in my house, but I had recently joined the school choir, and so had he, and I had opportunities for speaking to him occasionally after choir practice. I was unconscious of sexual feeling for him. Our conversations were always impersonal. Our acquaintance was commented on, and I was warned by one of the masters to end it. I replied that I would not have my PG-77 friendships in any way limited. I pointed out that this boy was interested in the same things as myself, particularly in books, that the disparity in our ages was unfortunate, but that a lack of intelligence among the boys of my own age made it necessary for me to find friends where I could. Finally, the headmaster took me to task about it. I lectured him on the advantage of friendship between elder and younger boys, citing Plato, the Greek poets, Shakespeare, Michelangelo, and others who had felt the same way as I did. He let me go without taking any action. In my 5th year, I was in the 6th form and was made a house monitor. There were 6 house monitors. One of them was the house games captain, a friendly, easygoing fellow. He said to me one day, "Look here, Graves, I have been asked to send in a list of competitors for the inter-house boxing competition. Shall I put your name down?" I had not boxed for 2 terms. I had been busy with football and played for the house team now. And since my coolness with Raymond boxing had lost its interest, I said, "I'm not boxing these days." "Well," he said, "young Alan is entering for the welterweights. He's got a very good chance. Why don't you enter for the welterweights too? You might be able to damage 1 or 2 of the stronger men and make it easier for him." I did not particularly like the idea of making things easier for Alan, but I obviously had to enter the competition. I had a reputation to keep up. I knew, however, that my wind, though all right for football, was not equal to boxing round after round. I decided that my fights must be short. The night before the competition, I smuggled a bottle of cherry whiskey into the house. I would shorten the fights on that. I had never drank anything alcoholic before in my life. PG-78. When I was 7 years old, I was prevailed on to sign the pledge. My pledge card bound me to abstain by the grace of God from all spirituous liquors, so long as I retained it. But my mother took the card from me and put it safely in the box room with the Jacobean silver inherited from my Shane grandmother, Bishop Graves' diamond ring which Queen Victoria gave him when he preached before her, our christening mugs, and the heavy early Victorian jewelry bequeathed to my mother by the old lady whom she had looked after. And since box room treasures never left the box room, I regarded myself as permanently parted from my pledge. I liked the cherry whiskey a lot. The competition started about 1 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon and went on until 7. I was drawn for the very first fight, and my opponent by a piece of bad luck was Alan. Alan wanted me to scratch. I said I thought that it would look bad to do that. We consulted the house games captain, and he said, "No, the most sporting thing to do is to box it out and let the decision be on points. But don't either of you hurt each other." So we boxed. Alan started showing off to his friends, who were sitting in the front row. I said, "Stop that, we're boxing, not fighting." But a few seconds later he hit me again, unnecessarily hard. I got angry and knocked him out. This was the first time I had ever knocked anyone out, and I liked the feeling. I had drank a lot of cherry whiskey. I rather muzzily realized that I had knocked him out with a right swing on the side of the neck, and that this blow was not part of the ordinary school boxing curriculum. Straight lefts, lefts to body, rights to head, left and right hooks, all these were known, but the swing was somehow neglected, probably because it was not so pretty. I went to the changing room for my coat, and stout PG-79 Sergeant Harris, the boxing instructor, said, "Look here, Mr. Graves, why don't you put down your name for the middleweight competition, too?" I cheerfully agreed. Then I went back to the house and had a cold bath and more cherry whiskey. My next fight was to take place in about half an hour for the first round of the middleweights. This time my opponent, who was a stone heavier than myself but had little science, bustled me about for the first round, and I could see that he would tire me out unless something was done. In the second round I knocked him down with my right swing, but he got up again. I was feeling tired, so hastened to knock him down again. I must have knocked him down 4 or 5 times that round, but he refused to take the count. I found out afterwards that he was, like myself, conscious that Dick was watching the fight. He loved Dick too, finally I said to myself as he lurched towards me again. If he doesn't go down and stay down this time, I won't be able to hit him again at all. This time I just pushed at his jaw as it offered itself to me, but that was enough. He did go down and he did stay down. This second knockout made quite a stir. Knockouts were rare in the inter-house boxing competition. As I went back to the house for another cold bath and some more cherry whiskey, I noticed the fellows looking at me curiously. The later stages of the competition I do not remember well. The only opponent that I was now at all concerned about was Raymond, who was nearly a stone heavier than myself, and was expected to win the middleweights. But he had also tried for 2 weights, the middle and the heavy, and had just had such a tough fight with the eventual winner of the heavyweights that he was in no proper condition to fight. So he scratched his fight with me. I believe that he Prog's 80 would have fought all the same if it had been against someone else, but he was still fond of me and wanted me to win. His scratching would give me a rest between my bouts. A semi-finalist scratched against me in the welterweights, so I only had 3 more fights, and I let neither of these go beyond the first round. The swing won me both weights, for which I was given 2 silver cups, but it had also broken both my thumbs. I had not got my elbow high enough over when I used it. The most important thing that happened to me in my last 1-2 years, apart from my attachment to Dick, was that I got to know George Mallory. He was 26 or 27 then, not long up from Cambridge. He was so young-looking that he was often mistaken for a member of the school. From the first he treated me as an equal, and I used to spend my spare time reading books in his room or going for walks with him in the country. He told me of the existence of modern authors. My father being 2 generations older than myself and my only link with books, I had never heard of people like Shaw, Samuel Butler, Rupert Brooke, Wells, Flecker, or Masefield, and I was greatly interested in them. It was at George Mallory's rooms that I first met Edward Marsh, who has always been a good friend to me, and with whom, though we seldom see each other now, I have never fallen out. In this he is almost unique among my pre-war friends. Marsh said that he liked my poems, which George had showed him, but pointed out that they were written in the poetic vocabulary of 50 years ago, and that, though the quality of the poem was not necessarily impaired by this, there would be a natural prejudice in my readers against work written in 1913 in the fashions of 1863. George Mallory, Cyril Hartman, Raymond, and I published PG-81A magazine in the summer of 1913 called Green Chartreuse. It was only intended to have 1 number. New magazines at a public school always sell out the first number and lose heavily on the second. From Green Chartreuse I quote one of my own contributions, of autobiographical interest, written in the school dialect, my Newbugs exam. When lights went out at 9:30 in the evening of the second Friday in the quarter, and the faint footfalls of the departing housemaster were heard no more, the fun began. The plead of under cubicles constituted himself examiner and executioner, and was ably assisted by a timekeeper, a question recorder, and a staff of his disreputable friends. I was a timorous Newbug then, and my pajamas were damp with the perspiration of fear. 3 of my fellows had been examined and sentenced before the inquisition was directed against me. "It's Jones' turn now," said a voice. "He's the little brute that hacked me in runabout today. We must set him some tight questions." "I say, Jones, what's the color of the housemaster? I mean, what's the name of the housemaster of the house, whose colors are black and white? 1, 2, 3. Mr. Girdlestone." My voice quivered in the darkness. "He evidently knows the simpler colors." "We'll muddle him. What are the colors of the clubs to which blockhouses belong? 1, 2, 3, 4. I had been slaving at getting up these questions for days, and just managed to blurt out the answer before being counted out. "Prague, 82, 2 questions. No misses." "We must buck up," said someone. "I say, Jones, how do you get to Farncombe from Weekites? 1, 2, 3. I had only issued directions as far as bridge before being counted out. 3 questions, 1 miss. You're allowed 3 misses out of 10. Where's Charterhouse Magazine? 1, 2, 3, 4. Do you mean the Carthusian office? I asked. Everyone laughed. 4 questions. 2 misses. I say Robinson. He's answered far too many. We'll set him a couple of stingers. Much whispering. What is the age of the horse that rolls under green? 1, 2, 3. 6! I said, at a venture. Wrong. 38. 6 questions. 3 misses. Think yourself lucky you weren't asked its pedigree. What are canoeing colors? 1, 2, 3. There aren't any. You'll get cocked up for festivity, but you can count it. 7 questions. 3 misses. Jones? Yes. What was the name of the girl to whom rumor stated that last year's football secretary was violently attached? 1, 2, 3, 4. Daisy! It sounded a likely name. Oh, really? Well, I happen to know last year's football secretary, and he'll simply kill you for spreading scandal. You're wrong anyhow. 8 questions. 4 misses. PG 83. You'll come to my cube at 7 tomorrow morning. See? Good night. Here he waved his hairbrush over the candle, and a colossal shadow appeared on the ceiling. The Poetry Society died about this time, and this is how it died. 2 of its 6th form members came to a meeting, and each read a rather dull and formal poem about love and nature. None of us paid much attention to them, but the following week they were published in the Carthusian, and soon everyone was pointing and giggling. Both poems, which were signed with pseudonyms, were acrostics, the initial letters spelling out a case. Case meant romance. A formal coupling of 2 boys' names, with the name of the elder boy first. In these 2 cases, both the first names mentioned were those of Bloods. It was a foolish act of aggression in the feud between 6th form and the Bloods. But nothing much would have come of it had not another of the 6th form members of the Poetry Society been in love with one of the smaller boys whose names appeared in the acrostics. In rage and jealousy, he went to the headmaster and called his attention to the acrostic, which otherwise neither he nor any other of the masters would have noticed. He pretended that he did not know the authors, but though he had not been at the particular meeting where the poems were read, he could easily have guessed them from the styles. Before things had taken this turn, I had incautiously told someone who the authors were, so I was now dragged into the row as a witness against them. The headmaster took a very serious view of the case. The 2 poets were deprived of their monitorial privileges. The editor of the Carthusian, who, though aware of the acrostics, had PG 84 accepted the poems, was deprived of his editorship and of his position as head of the school. The informer, who happened to be next in school order, succeeded him in both capacities. He had not expected this development, and it made him most unpopular. His consolation was a real one, that he had done it all for love, to avenge the public insult done to the boy. And he was a decent fellow, really. The Poetry Society was dissolved in disgrace by the headmaster's orders. Guy Kendall was one of the few masters who insisted on treating the boys better than they deserved, so I was sorry for him when this happened. It was an I told you so for the other masters, who did not believe either in poetry or in school uplift societies. I owe a great debt of gratitude to Kendall. The meetings of the Poetry Society were all that I had to look forward to when things were at their worst for me. My last year at Charterhouse, I devoted myself to doing everything I could to show how little respect I had for the school tradition. In the winter of 1913, I won a classical exhibition at St. John's College, Oxford, so that I could go slow on schoolwork. Neville Barber and I were editing the Carthusian, and a good deal of my time went in that. Neville, who as a scholar had met the same sort of difficulties as myself, also had a dislike of most Charterhouse traditions. We decided that the most objectionable tradition of all was compulsory games. Of these, cricket was the most objectionable, because it wasted most time in the best part of the year. We began a campaign in favor of tennis. We were not seriously devoted to tennis, but it was the best weapon we had against cricket. The game, we wrote, in which the selfishness of the few was supposed to excuse the boredom of the many. Tennis was quick and busy. We asked old Carthusian PG 85 tennis internationalists to contribute letters proposing tennis as the manlier and more vigorous game. We even got the famous Anthony Wilding to write. The game's masters were scandalized at this assault on cricket. To them, tennis was pat ball, a game for girls. But the result of our campaign was surprising. Not only did we double our sales, but a fund was started for providing the school with a number of tennis courts, and making Charterhouse the cradle of public school tennis. Though delayed by the war, these courts actually appeared. I noticed them recently as I went past the school in a car. There seemed to be plenty of them. I wonder, are there tennis bloods at Charterhouse now? Poetry and Dick were now the only 2 things that really mattered. My life with my fellow house monitors was one of perpetual discord. I had grudges against them all except the house captain and the head monitor. The house captain, the only blood in the house, spent most of his time with his fellow bloods in other houses. The head monitor was a scholar who, though naturally a decent fellow, had been embittered by his first 3 years in the house, and was much on his dignity. He did more or less what the other monitors wanted him to do, and I was sorry that I had to lump him in with the rest. My love for Dick provoked a constant facetiousness, but they never dared to go too far. I once caught one of them in the bathroom scratching up a pair of hearts conjoined, with Dick's initials and mine on them. I pushed him into the bath and turned the taps on. The next day he got hold of a manuscript notebook of mine that I had left on the table in the monitor's room with some other books. It had poems and essay notes in it. He and the other monitors, except the house captain, annotated it critically in blue chalk and all signed their initials. The PG-86 house captain would have nothing to do with this. He thought it ungentlemanly. I was furious when I found what had been done. I made a speech. I demanded a signed apology. I said that if I were not given it within an hour, I would choose one of them as solely responsible and punish him. I said that I would now have a bath, and that the first monitor that I met after my bath I would knock down. Whether by accident or whether it was that he thought his position made him secure, the first monitor I met in the corridor was the head monitor. I knocked him down. It was the time of evening preparation, which only the monitors were free not to attend. But a fag happened to pass on an errand and saw the blow and the blood, so it could not be hushed up. The head monitor went to the housemaster, and the housemaster sent for me. He was an excitable elderly man who had some difficulty in controlling his spittle when angry. He made me sit down in a chair in his study, then stood over me, clenching his fists and crying in his high falsetto voice, "Do you realize you have done a very brutal action?" His mouth was bubbling. I was as angry as he was. I jumped up and clenched my fists too. Then I said that I would do the same thing to anyone who, after scribbling impertinent remarks on my private papers, refused to apologize. "Private papers! Filthy poems!" said the housemaster. I had another difficult interview with the headmaster over this, but it was my last term, so he allowed me to finish my 5 years without ignominy. He was puzzled by the frankness of my statement of love for Dick. He reopened the question. I refused to be ashamed. I heard afterwards that he had said that this was one of the rare cases of a friendship between boys of unequal ages which he felt was essentially PG-87 moral. I went through one of the worst quarters of an hour of my life on Dick's account in this last term. When the master had warned me about exchanging glances with Dick in chapel, I had been infuriated. But when I was told by one of the boys that he had seen the master surreptitiously kissing Dick once, on a choir treat or some such occasion, I went quite mad. I asked for no details or confirmation. I went to the master and told him he must resign, or I would report the case to the headmaster. He already had a reputation in the school for this sort of thing, I said. Kissing boys was a criminal offense. I was morally outraged. Probably my sense of outrage concealed a murderous jealousy. I was surprised when he vigorously denied the charge. I could not guess what was going to happen next. But I said, "Well, come to the headmaster and deny it to him." He asked, "Did the boy tell you this himself?" I said, "No." "Well then," he said, "I'll send for him here and he shall tell us the truth." So Dick was sent for and arrived looking very frightened, and the housemaster said menacingly, "Graves tells me that I once kissed you. Is that true?" Dick said. "Yes, it is true." So Dick was dismissed and the master collapsed, and I felt miserable. He said he would resign at the end of the term, which was quite near, on grounds of ill health. He even thanked me for speaking directly to him and not going to the headmaster. That was in the summer of 1914. He went into the army and was killed the next year. I found out much later from Dick that he had not been kissed at all. It may have been some other boy. One of the last events that I remember at Charterhouse was a debate with the motion that this house is in favor of compulsory military service. The Empire Service League, or whatever it was called, of which Earl Roberts of Kandahar, PG-88 VC, was the president, sent down a propagandist to support the motion. There were only 6 votes out of 119 cast against it. I was the principal speaker against the motion, a strong anti-militarist. I had recently resigned from the Officers' Training Corps, having revolted against the theory of implicit obedience to orders. And during a fortnight spent the previous summer at the OTC camp at Tidworth on Salisbury Plain, I had been frightened by a special display of the latest military fortifications, barbed wire entanglements, machine guns, and field artillery in action. General, now Field Marshal Sir William Robertson, whose son was a member of the school, had visited the camp and impressed upon us that war against Germany was inevitable within 2 or 3 years, and that we must be prepared to take our part in it as leaders of the new forces that would assuredly be called into being. Of the 6 voters against the motion, Neville Barber and I are, I believe, the only ones who survived the war. My last memory was the headmaster's goodbye. It was this: Well, goodbye, Graves. And remember this, that your best friend is the waste paper basket. I used to speculate on which of my contemporaries would distinguish themselves after they left school. The war upset my calculations. Many dull boys had brief, brilliant military careers, particularly as air fighters, becoming squadron and flight commanders. Fuzzy McNair, the head of the school, won the VC as a rifleman. Young Sturgis, who had been my study fag, distinguished himself more unfortunately by flying the first heavy bombing machine of a new pattern across the Channel on his first trip to France and making a beautiful landing, having mistaken the landmarks, at an aerodrome behind the German lines. A boy whom I admired, page 89, very much during my first year at Charterhouse was the Honorable Desmond O'Brien. He was the only Carthusian in my time who cheerfully disregarded all school rules. He had skeleton keys for the school library, chapel, and science laboratories, and used to break out of his house at night and carefully disarrange things there. The then headmaster was fond of O'Brien and forgave him much. O'Brien had the key of the headmaster's study too, and, going there one night with an electric torch, carried off a memorandum which he showed me. Must expel O'Brien. He had a wireless receiving station in one of the out-of-bounds copses on the school grounds, and he discovered a ventilator shaft down which he could hoot into the school library from outside and create great disturbance without detection. One day we were threatened with the loss of a Saturday half-holiday because some member of the school had killed a cow with a catapult, and nobody would own up. O'Brien had fired the shot. He was away at the time on special leave for a sister's wedding. A friend wrote to him about the half-holiday. He sent the headmaster a telegram, "Killed cow, sorry coming O'Brien." At last, having absented himself from every lesson in chapel for 3 whole days, he was expelled. He was killed early in the war while bombing Bruges. At least 1 in 3 of my generation at school was killed. This was because they all took commissions as soon as they could, most of them in the infantry and flying corps. The average life of the infantry subaltern on the Western Front was, at some stages of the war, only about 3 months. That is to say that at the end of 3 months he was either wounded or killed. The proportions worked out at about 4 wounded to every 1 killed. Of the 4, 1 was wounded seriously, and the remaining 3 more or less lightly. The 3 PG-90 lightly wounded returned to the front after a few weeks or months of absence, and were again subject to the same odds. The flying casualties were even higher. Since the war lasted for 4.5 years, it is easy to see why the mortality was so high among my contemporaries, and why most of the survivors, if not permanently disabled, were wounded at least 2 or 3 times. 2 well-known sportsmen were contemporaries of mine. A.G. Bauer, captain of England at soccer, who was only an average player at Charterhouse, and Wolf Barnato, the Surrey cricketer and millionaire racing motorist, who also was only an average player. Barnato was in the same house as myself, and we had not a word to say to each other for the 4 years we were together. 5 scholars have made names for themselves. Richard Hughes as a BBC playwright, Richard Goulden as an actor of old man parts, Vincent Seligman as author of A Propagandist Life of Venizelos, Cyril Hartman as an authority on historical French scandals, and my brother Charles as society gossip writer on the middle page of the Daily Mail. Occasionally I see another name or two in the newspapers. There was one the other day, M., who was in the news for escaping from a private lunatic asylum. I remembered that he had once offered a boy 10 shillings to hold his hand in a thunderstorm, and that he had frequently threatened to run away from Charterhouse.